Now, today I've been asked to continue the series that William introduced, and in particular last Sabbath he was discussing the subject of stewardship. And I've been asked to continue that. However, there is a little bit of a surprise perhaps in that. You would expect that maybe the treasurer would talk about the stewardship of money. But instead of that, we're on the stewardship of health. And our topic is 7 great steps, or 7 steps to great health. And looking at that, I probably should have called it 7 steps to greater health. So no matter what the condition of our health, perhaps there are some things we can do. In fact, I suggest there are, and we'll discuss those this morning, that we can do or participate in to have greater health than we have now. But more about that as we get into the topic. First of all, I'd like to invite you to open your Bibles to Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. And that's our key reference for today. And in fact, I suggest that we start reading not at Romans chapter 12, but Romans chapter 11 at verse 33. And here Paul is ending one of the several sections. There are several sections in the book of Romans. I'd love to discuss Romans with you. It's Paul's first letter that he wrote, and his greatest. And it's one of the greatest pieces of literature of all time. And it really is the only book in the Bible that sets out the plan of salvation in a systematic way. All of the books of the Bible, of course, contribute to our understanding of the plan of salvation, but Romans sets it out in a systematic way. It's the only one that does. However, as I said, each section ends with a doxology. And here, Paul is giving the doxology for the previous section. He says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has become his counselor? Or who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him?" Here this bit is implying, who among us has given something to God and now God owes us a debt? And the answer surely is absolutely no one. That everything we have comes from him. And then verse 36 goes on to say, "For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever." And so it's with that doxology where Paul is praising God for everything that he has given to us and acknowledging that there's nothing that he owes us, but we owe him everything. And then he goes on in our key verse where he talks about beseeching you therefore. Now, when we come across the word therefore, it refers back to what preceded it. Because God has given us everything, because we owe him nothing, we owe him everything, he owes us nothing. Therefore, he says, "I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service." Now, it appears to me that Paul is saying that we have a responsibility in relation to our bodies to offer them as living sacrifices to God. Sounds like stewardship, doesn't it? This reference to sacrifices and living sacrifices. Those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament will realize that right from the book of Genesis, the people back in those days were required to provide a sacrifice. Remember the story of Cain and Abel, and how Cain gave the wrong kind of offering and Abel the right one. He offered a lamb, he offered a sacrifice. And as we go through the laws relating to the rituals surrounding the temple, through Jewish times, they were required to provide offerings. Various animals were sacrificed. And when you brought an animal to the sacrifice, you didn't grab hold of something that was almost dead. God required the best, not the worst, not something at the end of its life, but a lamb that was top quality and perfect. And this was offered as a living sacrifice to God. And here Paul is alluding to that custom. He's saying, bring your bodies, make your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. So the question arises, if that's moving on, yes it is health a Christian resource? What do you think? Is health a resource that God gives us to use for His glory? We all agree it is. Now, stewardship is, according to one definition, the responsible planning and management of resources. Would you agree with that? Therefore, our bodies as a resource given to God is something that we have a duty, according to what Paul is saying here, to provide to Him as living sacrifices, to use our body and the gifts that He has given us to His glory. I think I've turned this on, but it doesn't seem to be moving. Yes, being fit and healthy is a lifestyle that pays handsome dividends. What do we mean by that? Being fit and healthy as a lifestyle. Well, health and fitness is often a result of a lifestyle, and so is the lack of it. But where we have health and fitness, and that when we have improved our health to the very best of our ability using what is available to us, then that pays handsome dividends. And as we go through, I'm going to prove that statement correct. I'm going to give you evidence that supports the fact that a healthy lifestyle provides very handsome dividends. But first of all, let's look at a couple more texts. Here we've got Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 33. You may like to have a look at it. It's right there, really after the Ten Commandments. Now, normally, when you're looking for the Ten Commandments in the Bible, you go to where? Exodus, isn't it? Exodus chapter 20. But have a look at the book of Deuteronomy. And that's Deuteronomy chapter 5. And right at the end of the chapter, the verse that we're referring to appears. But what is in front of that, right from the first verse of the chapter, is the Ten Commandments. So they're given here in Deuteronomy as well as Exodus chapter 20. And if we come over to verse 32, which is the second last verse of that chapter, it says, "So be careful what the Lord your God has commanded you. Do not turn aside to the right or to the left. Walk in the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land you will possess." So here Moses is saying to the people, keep my commandments. Be careful that you follow them, that you do what you're commanded, and there is a reward. There's a dividend, right? A lifestyle that pays a dividend. He's saying that you may live and prosper and prolong your days. So is it possible to extend our life through good lifestyle? Well, we all know what smoking does to life expectancy, don't we? That shortens life expectancy. So not smoking should extend it. There are other things that we can do as well as we look at these various steps that we can take. Yet another verse. Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health. Now we're in the New Testament, echoing what was said there in Deuteronomy chapter 5. I want you to prosper, he says, and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. So here, John in his epistle is saying, be careful not only about the spiritual health, your spiritual health, but also your physical health. And in some ways, that's a little surprising. You see, back in the 1st century, and 2nd and even the 3rd century, there was a sect that arose called Gnosticism. And the Gnostics believed that you need to deprive the body in order to build up the spiritual. So, anti-flesh, promote the spirit. Now, this text is saying promote both. Look after both. So, certainly not a Gnostic text. And when we have a look at things that were written by Paul, he was very much against this Gnosticism idea. It came more out of the philosophies of the Greeks, where the body was despised. And some of that idea flowed right through into the Middle Ages and into the medieval church, where you've got people like Martin Luther, for example. You might have read about him and other monks sort of punishing themselves, whipping themselves and whatever. They had to deprive the body in order for the spiritual part of the person to thrive. And this certainly isn't God's plan. In fact, God's plan is more like what we're told in this next quote. And I actually want to go back one slide, thank you. That's the one. Here we have something from the Ministry of Healing, written by Ellen White. She said, men and women must be awakened to the duty of self-mastery. They need to be impressed with the fact that all their powers of mind and body are a gift of God. And so here Ellen White, she was one of the pioneers, of course, of the Adventist Church. She wasn't the founder of it, but she was one of the pioneers, and indeed the most prominent, and I would think the most influential. And one of the legacies, the many legacies that she has left, has been what we call the health ministry. And the church, as a result of the philosophy that she expressed and the physical encouragement that she gave, went into the hospital business. The hospitals of Battle Creek, and of course we have the Austrings. You were in hospitals in Hong Kong. And I've visited 2 of those hospitals. The one, of course, high up on the hill there on Stubbs Road, big circular one. I was over there for a conference a few years ago. The firm that I worked for sent me over to Hong Kong. And on the Sabbath, I decided to seek out Adventists and finished up going to the service at that particular hospital. And then I had the opportunity also to visit the hospital at Jinwan, which of course you will be very familiar with. And that's just one example of the many outreaches that we as a church have enjoyed as a result of following the biblical instruction and this instruction endorsed in the writings of Ellen White. Here's some more of her quote. She says, true education is the harmonious development of the physical, mental, and spiritual powers. So if we're going to be stewards of what God has given us, we need to seek out true education, which is defined here as the harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and our spiritual powers. She goes on to say that every human being created in the image of God is endowed with a power akin to that of the Creator. Individuality, power to think and do. And so the mission work that has been undertaken by our church is very much in line with this teaching and thinking about health stewardship. I've had a little bit of a personal experience of that myself. In fact, Elizabeth and I both lived in this area for some years. We first lived just down here, right at the very end, near Milne Bay. And we lived on a little island there. But the reason I'm telling you the story is that one of the trips that we made, and our territory covered right, included Kokoda, Popondetta, all of those islands. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because when we went there, the work of the church was very, very small. There are hardly any members. Today it's quite different. And in particular, we did have some members on these islands, Ferguson Island, Normanby Island, but not on Good Enough. And one night we decided to stay at Good Enough. In fact, we were heading out here to the Trobriands. And it was just too far to go, so we decided overnight at a little bay on Good Enough. And we pulled into a little wharf there, and just as we were tying up, this is a 45-foot mission boat, just as we were tying up, some of the locals came out very, very angry and tried to chase us away. You can't stay here, you can't stop here. And quite ferocious. Now, I was a bit younger then, in fact, I was in my 20s then, and that's some time ago. And I jumped over the edge of the boat onto the wharf and stood right in front of this fellow who was demanding that we leave, and asked him what his problem was. The problem was that our predecessors with this boat had done exactly the same thing. They'd decided to overnight there. And then the locals had come along with their bags of copra and said, we want you to take this copra. The dried out coconuts, take it into the markets. And they refused. So you're not going to take our copra for us, then we're not going to let you stay here. And I tried to explain to them that our mission ships were not licensed to carry cargo. We'd be breaking the law if we did it, and that's why they said no. We didn't have permission to do that. Anyway, we had a bit of a chat, and they allowed us to stay. Interesting time, just as a little aside, some of us decided to go swimming that evening, and in particular I thought, well, I'll swim out and go right round the boat and back in the other side. Now, our eldest daughter, who was only just 5 at the time, unbeknownst to me, had decided to follow me, and she couldn't swim. I was part way around, and a fish or something hit my foot. It scared me a bit, and I went back, and there I saw Karen floundering in the water. But anyhow, moving on with this story, a few months later, we went back there and we had some passengers. And the passengers were a young doctor boy and his wife. And he had volunteered to go there, because we'd noticed that there were lots of tropical sores and diseases and no medical help whatsoever on Good Enough Island, and we felt that wasn't good enough. And so this dedicated young couple decided to stay there. They went and built a place to stay out of bamboo and whatever they could find there, coconuts and just the local materials, the kind of houses that the local people built. They built them up and lived in them. And armed with a wonderful medical kit, which I think consisted of some Aspro and penicillin injections. That was about the limit of their skills. And everything was treated, it seemed, with the same prescription. But it made a big difference and a big impression, and the people there, many of them were healed. And even the basic medicine that they could provide at that time was sufficient to make a huge difference to the lives of the people. And a church got started there. And that's how we got started on Good Enough Island. And that story has been repeated many times throughout the Pacific. Later, this little story I'm telling you about happened before the Northeast Papua Mission existed. Now it has its headquarters at Popondetta. I was actually the first ever president of Northeast Papua Mission. And it only had a handful of members. Today in that area, the membership is 6,681. The population in that whole scattered area, which covers over 100,000 square miles, is under 450,000. So if you do the maths on that, we should have 20,000 plus members in Auckland. And the entering wedge, if I might use that tired old expression, was health ministry. Not only on Good Enough Island, but lots of other places. When we went there, we had six of these so-called trained doctor boys with that very, very basic training. Things have become much more sophisticated since. They have I was looking on the internet last night at the mission office. It still looks quite small, but the one we had was more like a garage. And then the president's chair was, initially it was a drum turned upside down. That's what you sat on. But things have got much more sophisticated since then, from those very early days, which are a long time ago. I'm just reminded of that because our son has his birthday this week. He's 41, I think, this week. He was born while we were out there. So it is a long, long time ago. But the work of God has progressed and developed remarkably, and the contribution of stewardship of health and the belief in that idea within our church has certainly had a very, very big part in it. So I have a question now, and that's on our next slide. What if you could add up to 10 years to your life? I mean, we looked at text, didn't we, where you know, the Bible says, do the right things, I want you to prosper and have a long life. That sounds a bit like one of the movies, isn't it? Prosper and live long and prosper. But that's exactly what God wants. And what I've got there, and it may be a little difficult to read, it's part of the text of something that was published in the National Geographic magazine back in 2005. I'll read it to you. It says, Seventh-day Adventists who avoid junk food and caffeine tend to live 4 to 10 years longer than the average Californian. So here was a study that was done in California, and they found that Adventists across the board tended to live between 4 and 10 years longer. It was 4 years longer if you're female and 10 years longer for males. Then there's a quote there. It says, we need someone to guide us in this life, and we need great hope. And that's quoted from Marge, who at the time was aged 100, and she just passed her driver's license test for another 5 years. Not bad, is it? So yes, it looks like it is possible to extend your life expectancy. Ever since 1950, Seventh-day Adventists have been among the populations of the world the most highly studied by researchers. So the fact that the Adventist lifestyle is having an impact upon people who follow it, so much so that the scientific community has started to notice, and has done since 1950. That's a long time ago. Approximately 250 research studies have been published in scientific journals showing the benefits of the Adventist lifestyle. Here are the results of some more findings. And I should go through this, reasonably quickly. California Seventh-day Adventist men live an average of 8.9 years longer than other Californian men. That's one study. Adventist women in California live an average of 7.5 years longer than other women in that state. Polish Seventh-day Adventist men live an average of 9.5 years longer than other Polish men. And Adventist women in Poland live an average of 4.5 years longer than other women in that nation. And I think we have some more. Yeah, I'd just like to go back one. Dutch Seventh-day Adventists. Men live an average of 8.9 years longer than other Dutchmen. Adventist women in Holland live an average of 3.7 years longer than other women in that country. Norwegian Seventh-day Adventist men live an average of 4.2 years longer than other Norwegian men. And Adventist women in Norway live an average of 1.9 years longer than other Norwegian women. So yes, it makes a difference. There must be something in this health message after all. Just, there we are. And one more. Yes, oh. That's the one we're looking for. Keeping of the Sabbath. It's a good way to get stress out of your life. You probably know that anyway. I don't know what I'd have done without the Sabbath over the years. I think with my temperament, I'd have worked 7 days. The Sabbath for us has been a great time to spend with our children, and more lately with our grandchildren. Great family time, and of course a great time to fellowship also with the family of God. Reading further from this National Geographic magazine article, it says, look at what they do on Saturday. They stop everything. They focus on their God. They cut the stress out of what they need to do. They all go to luncheons with really good friends, and then they're off on a nature walk. Does any of that sound familiar? And the payoff is 6 extra years of life for an Adventist female and nearly 10 extra years for an Adventist male. So there's something in it. Whatever it is, whatever it does, keep doing it. Our next slide is from Canada. And sorry, it's not from Harvard University in the United States. It says such an increase in the life expectancy at these adult ages is greater than all of the gains in life expectancy made in the past 60 years in this country as a result of all the advances in medical skills and knowledge. Now that's some statement, isn't it? What has been achieved through the Adventist community, and I'm quite sure we're not all as good as we ought to be at this, but in spite of that, the advances that have been made by simply living the lifestyle according to what God has given us and the instructions that have come down through the writings of Ellen White have added more, according to this professor at Harvard University, than all of the other gains in life expectancy that have been achieved in medical skills and knowledge, plus innumerable improvements of the environment in which man lives. So medical advances, improvements in the environment, they've had an effect, but nothing quite as much as the effect of simply living the way God wants us to. Is health stewardship? I think it is. In fact, here's a message it was for the Canadian government initially, a statement written by a Canadian official. This was back in 1980. I guess they weren't listening. How to cut billions of dollars off the health budget, because that keeps rising, doesn't it? He says, I've got some advice on how to improve the health of the Canadians and at the same time cut billions of dollars off our annual health costs. I think we should study the lifestyle of adherents of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and then explore ways and means of persuading the public to emulate the Adventists in at least some ways. That's a great testimony, isn't it, from somebody who I presume is not an Adventist? What a difference could be made. All right, so what are these 7 steps that we can take to great health, or let me correct that, to greater health? I suspect that none of us actually has perfect health. We all have things to deal with. And the last thing I want to do this morning is sound like the Pharisees did, who say, well, who sinned, this man or his parents, because he was born blind? I don't want to sound that way. I don't want to sound judgmental. And I know that there are people in this congregation, people everywhere, who are suffering from illnesses of various kinds. And if you're one of those, you're one of 99.99% of the population. I suggest 100%, because everybody's got something. Now, there are medical people here in the congregation who are better qualified than me to comment on that, but I would believe that it's very rare to find anybody in our society who doesn't have some sort of health or medical problem. And so these steps, these 7 steps to greater health, are actually taken from the writings of Ellen White. In the 7 steps there's nutrition, eating good food, being careful about our diet, not only what we eat, but the quantity, exercise, being active. What a difference regular exercise can make. And actually, the older we get, the bigger impact it has, the more beneficial it is. And then there's that very expensive commodity called water. If you can buy it in bottles, it is expensive and probably a waste of money. But plenty of water inside and outside. So keeping clean as well as water inside the body as well. And sunshine. Well, we've got plenty of that at the moment. So make the most of the sunshine. Now, once again, of course, I'm not suggesting you just lie on the beach and bake without taking some precautions, because that can be bad for health as well. And this country has a very high incidence of melanoma. But sunshine, of course, brings us many benefits. Temperance. Temperance is a great old-fashioned word, isn't it? Temperance. It's not actually a wowzer word in my view. Temperance is being moderate about what we do, not going to extremes. I think you can be intemperate on your drinking of your water. You can be intemperate on eating wheat and goodness knows what else, as well as other things that we might want to take into our bodies or not take into our bodies. What a tragedy it is that there's so many people in this country who feel they need to have some sort of drugs to help them along. Remember it was on the news, I think, yesterday. Millions of dollars has to be spent on state houses to repair them because of all the people who are running their P-labs in them. Why is it that we are so dependent on stuff like that? It suggests to me something very lacking in a person's life. And again, I don't want to be judgmental or critical. Number 6 there is air. Yeah, getting plenty of that. Fresh air, and I see plenty of people and we don't have air conditioning in this church. But it's very warm air here at the moment. But it's good to get fresh air, good to get out in the fresh air, rather than being sort of stuck inside all the time. One of the things I almost resent about going to work, we got one of these offices where there's air conditioning, so I guess it's pretty much the same when it's day and night, and summer and winter. And some of these lovely summer days, I've been thinking, well, hey, I turned up here at the office at a bit before 8 and I'm leaving and it's nearly 5. And the good day, what a brilliant day it was outside. And I think it's good for us to get out and move about. Some of us, including me, even have lunch in the building. So we go into the building early in the morning and leave at 5 or something. And maybe I should be listening to my own sermon. And likewise on number 7, rest. Have you noticed how much more effective you can be if you've had a good rest? And we studied in our Sabbath school lesson today about rest, and it has several meanings and several uses in the Bible. There is, of course, the Sabbath rest. The word Sabbath, Shabbat, is rest. That's what it means. And when God created the world, created in 6 days, and He rested. I think in various parts of the world they've experimented with a weekly cycle other than 7 days. And it's never worked, it's never lasted. We need to have our Sabbath rest, and we need to have adequate sleep at night as well, if we're going to restore our bodies and work at our optimal efficiency, if we're going to have bodies that benefit from stewardship that God has spoken about, we need to have our adequate rest. Well, that's 7 steps to great health. Would you like a bonus? Here's number 8. And the original statement has 8. And the bonus one, trust in divine power. And it is the bonus. It's the super bonus. It's the thing that makes the difference. Whatever we do in life, if we're trusting in God and in His will, what a difference it makes. Well, there are many things we could talk about, and I know time is moving on. So just recapping these 7 steps to health. What's your memory like? What's the first one? Nutrition, thank you. And exercise and water. Someone was taking notes, I'm sure. Yeah, temperance. Air. Oh, yes. And trust in God. Do you think that's a pretty good prescription? Now, I'm not going to go into a heap of detail on these, and there are people in this congregation, as I've mentioned already, who are far better qualified to give you health advice than I am. So I'm not going to do that. Rather, I prefer to deal with the big issues. But imagine for a moment, and we're allowed to do a bit of imagining. Imagine yourself being able to enhance your physical prowess and extend your life expectancy with a fit, trim body, high energy, and enhanced resistance to colds and flu, as well as protecting yourself from such big killers as heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Would that be a good deal? That'd be worth having? I certainly think so as well. And the prescription for that, we've seen, is in the Scriptures and in the writings that we've quoted from Ellen White. How'd you like to be able to sharpen up your mental ability? Yeah, I certainly need that. And to improve the spiritual dimension of your life. The big bonus. That's there too. So quickly to recap what we learned from the Bible about health. There's the Old Testament, of course. There was the Levitical system, the health laws of those times. And while some of them may look a little archaic today, they were extremely relevant for their time, and they protected the health of the people. So those old health laws were great. Think about Jesus and health. Now, when we look at Jesus and health, we don't really see any prescribed diets, or rather it's miraculous that he performed miracles. He saw a man who had been crippled for 38 years, wasn't it? Sitting there waiting for the water to ripple, and the first one in, according to their superstition, would be healed. He healed on the Sabbath. He went out of his way, it seems, to annoy the church leaders of the day by performing health miracles on the Sabbath. After all, you could argue that the man who had been there for 38 years crippled, he didn't have to be healed on Sabbath. Surely he could have waited till after sunset to do it. Wouldn't you think, after 38 years? Jesus, of course, said he was Lord of the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was made for man. And the people of those days, the church leaders of those days, had put so many laws and regulations around the Sabbath, they'd kind of made it for them rather than for mankind. Jesus also said to a man who had been brought into a house where he was talking to a group of people, and there's so many people around that they couldn't get him in. It says that they couldn't get near him for the press. Seems to be a modern problem, doesn't it? So instead, they had to let him down through the roof. And Jesus asked the question, which is the most difficult? To tell this man his sins are forgiven, or to tell him to get up and walk? Now, most people would have thought, oh, yes, you can tell him his sins are forgiven. How do you objectively prove or disprove that? But I asked him to get up and walk. That's a bit harder to argue with. And of course, Jesus did both. And so he linked physical and the spiritual. And I think it was appropriate at that time because there was a common belief among the people then that if you were sick, you had to have done something wrong, or your parents or family had done something wrong. And so people who were suffering from various sicknesses were kind of under a double shadow. Not only did they have to suffer with very little medical assistance, but on top of that, they were seen to be sinners and therefore being punished by God. What a terrible belief that is. In a sense, of course, it's right. Only in a sense. Because sickness is a consequence of sin, isn't it? And one of the areas that Jesus came to conquer was the devil. And his weapon was illness. And by extending life, and by healing life, and by giving people hope, he was taking on the devil in a full frontal fight and winning. Now this raises a question which we don't have much time to discuss today: faith healing. You know, what about the faith healers? Why don't you Adventists do that? You know, lay hands on people and ask their ailments to go away, and so they come up the aisle hobbling and in wheelchairs, and they go out skipping and running. You ever been to a meeting like that? We're warned that the devil can perform miracles too, and that the last days that'll be one thing to watch out for. But there is a faith healing in the Bible, and that faith healing talks about anointing the sick and praying. And I know there are people in this congregation who have seen that work. I've seen the success of that. But the prayer should always be, if it be thy will. One of the greatest men of all time, excluding Jesus, of course, was the Apostle Paul. And yes, he, like me and perhaps you and most other people, didn't have totally perfect health. He had some kind of an ailment that irked him a lot. He called it the thorn in the flesh. And he said, I went to God, I beseeched him 3 times. And God's answer was, my grace is sufficient for you. You know, if God's grace is sufficient for Paul, what about me? What about you? So we can talk a lot about health, the importance of it, and the things that we can do to improve our situation. But we also need to have compassion and tolerance for those who suffer health issues. I don't believe there's any room for smugness. Just saying, hey, I only eat such and such a food and therefore I'm good and healthy and you're no good, and by the way, I've got the lowest cholesterol in Auckland. There's no room for that at all, I don't believe. But there is room for health evangelism, for spreading the good news that not only is God interested in healing us spiritually, but physically as well. After all, 4 of the 6 letters in the word health are heal. And we all need healing, both spiritually and in many cases physically as well. I'm just trying to make that go. One more. Back one. Just a few points that are quite obvious. This is not heaven on earth, so we don't have perfection here. Trials and difficulties will keep arising, testing our faith. But following the biblical blueprint makes it easier to cope with life's positives and negatives. What do you think about that? I think that's true. Quoting from Ellen White, My Life Today, she says, "A pure, healthy life is most favourable for the perfection of Christian character and for the development of the powers of mind and body." Lifestyle, a Christian lifestyle, is the best thing to develop the powers of our mind and our body and, of course, our spiritual character, which is that final dimension. Most people, when they talk about health, of course, focus on the physical, the mental, the emotional development of the individual and leave out the most important, and that's the spiritual, thereby missing a vital element. I believe it's faith in God that is one of the main contributors, probably the main contributor, to the extended lifespan of Adventists in the surveys that have been done. I think even more so than whether they eat Weet-Bix or Marmite or Vegemite or whatever. But it's interesting, even the health food message, that came worldwide from the Adventist Church. Did you know that? Dr. Kellogg, you've all heard of Kellogg's foods. He was one of the early Adventists. It was his company, not the church's. The church later developed its own sanitarium in this part of the world. But you imagine the difference that has made. Years ago, I read a rather irreverent book called The Great American Stomachache. And this book told the story about Kellogg, told the story about health foods, and the transformation in the breakfast food habits of the population. And how instead of having those big, heavy, meaty breakfasts, that people moved across to really the health food revolution. And it's worldwide. And you see them today even heading to work, sitting in their cars with their Weet-Bix or whatever and trying to eat and drive to work in the morning. I see them sometimes. What a difference it's made. And what a difference the health message has made to this denomination. We're still very small in world terms, but growing. And do you think the message that we have is going to benefit other people? Absolutely so. And I'd like to finish with a quote from Jesus. Because we can talk about all sorts of physical and mental development and stuff that could tend to be self-centered. But here Jesus is saying, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Trust in God. Seek to do his will. Accept his will, even if it isn't ours. Trust in him and be glad and rejoice in the things that he has done for us. And I believe that's one of the primary keys to living a healthy and long life. God bless you all.